Recent reports of surges in Muslim immigration to the United States are raising concerns that domestic terrorism threats could soon be on the rise as well. What are the facts on this story? Should immigration in general, or among Muslims in particular, be curtailed? Author and columnist Paul Sperry has written extensively on this issue. He is the author of Infiltration, How Muslim Spies and Subversives Have Penetrated Washington. In a recent column for Investors Business Daily, Sperry suggests immigration problems in Europe also give America plenty of incentive to rethink our own policies. And Paul, thanks very much for being with us.
Glad to be with you.
What do we know for sure about the rate of Muslim immigration to the United States? Are we seeing a spike in that area?
Yeah, it's a huge surge under Obama. Over the last 3 years, he's averaged 100,000 new immigrants from Muslim nations a year, and that is very alarming. It's more than we're importing both immigrants from Central America and Mexico combined. So this is a big shift in immigration flows. And a lot of these are so-called refugees from Iraq and Syria and Somalia. And I believe a little under 50,000 of these have come in from Iraq. And now they're planning on increasing the refugees, immigrants from Syria. Now, Syria has always been on our terrorist list, and we have had very strict restrictions on Syrian immigration. But since Syria has become a failed state, Obama has increased the number of refugees. By the time he leaves office, we will be importing over 10,000 Syrians into this country. And this is a concern because, of course, Iraq and Syria are now controlled by the Islamic State, ISIS.
Paul, are we accepting these folks into the country pretty much in bulk, or is there some sort of screening process to determine whether or not they do pose any sort of national security threat?
Well, at the top levels of the administration, DHS and so forth, they claim that these refugees are being vetted, but it's a complete farce. And we know that from testimony from the FBI officials who are in charge of that type of vetting process for terrorists coming in under visas and these refugee programs. And they admit under oath that they have no idea who these people are, and they can't find out, what type of backgrounds they have, criminal, terrorism, or otherwise, because there is no vetting opportunities. You can't vet somebody if you don't have documentation, police records, etc. And of course, Iraq and Syria are now failed states, and the police there are no police records, and so we are not vetting these folks, as it turns out, not at all. We have no idea if they're going to come to this country, coming here to escape terrorism, or if they're going to carry out terrorism, and that's the real reason they're coming. We have no idea, and they admit as much. And for all we know, they could be joining a sleeper cell here.
We're talking with author and columnist Paul Sperry. And Paul, does the administration simply chalk up the increased numbers to the refugee status from some of these countries, or are there other reasons, either stated or unstated, that these numbers are rising?
Yeah, the main reason is they're chalking it to the refugee scenario. However, and something I didn't get into in this particular column, but I have in the past, is the number of Saudi students. The visas for students from Saudi Arabia has skyrocketed under Obama after this deal he secretly cut with former King Abdullah, the late king, and you're seeing all sorts of young Saudi men flooding our college campuses at the same time right now. So that's separate and apart from the refugee scenario.
In your column, you say there should be a lot of lessons our government, our leaders should be learning from the massive influx of Muslim immigrants in Western Europe. What are the key lessons to be learned there?
Well, just three off the top is Copenhagen and Brussels and Paris. You had these no-go zones where these terrorists came from. They're just breeding grounds for these type of terrorists, and so many of these European Muslims are going over and joining ISIS, and many of them are coming back to carry out attacks. and they opened the floodgates for North African Muslims. And now they regret it, of course. It's too late. So Europe regrets doing what we're doing now. We're the ones who are rolling out the welcome mat for Muslims from these hostile nations. And it's really insane what we're doing. And no one's really talking about it, but this mass immigration from Muslim countries poses a serious national security threat.
Do you, through your reporting and your research, get the feeling that our country or any jurisdictions in our country are starting to drift towards no-go zones? We obviously don't have those, but do you get the sense that that sympathy is building in that area?
Oh, yeah. See, this is what just is so frustrating when politicians get up there. They never get out of their office there in Capitol Hill when they say, oh, our Muslims are so much more better assimilated in their Western eyes and they love America, unlike the European Muslims. That is just nonsense on stilts. These folks, these politicians need to get out and go into some of the communities just in their backyard. Alexandria, Virginia, for example, Bailey's Crossroad. They actually called that area Northern Virginistan. Then you have Dearbornistan, Michigan, and Minneapolis, which is we've brought in so many Somalian refugees that they've turned Minneapolis into a terror hotspot. I mean, they are very belligerent, very aggressive about asserting their culture onto the West. And Minneapolis mayor now is wearing a hijab when she meets with Muslim leaders. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And then, of course, in Dearbornistan, they've agreed to allow them to blare their call to prayer over the loudspeakers in violation of the noise ordinances in cities around Detroit. So that's coming to the rest of America if we keep importing this many Muslims. It's not just a terrorist threat. There's also a criminal threat and a cultural threat. Now, the criminal threat stems from we're seeing spikes in domestic violence in these communities because this is allowed under the Quran to beat your wife if she quote-unquote disobeys you. We're seeing more honor killings where under these Sharia law, if a young daughter who's a Westerner or adopts Western clothing or dates a non-Muslim, it's incumbent upon, it's the duty, in fact, they believe, of the father or the brother to actually kill the daughter. And then there's also what we're seeing more and more of, and we just saw a big report out of the Justice Department. They're worried about all these refugees, especially Iraq and Somalia, carrying out genital female mutilation. This is mutilating young girls, little girls. We're seeing hundreds of thousands of these cases in America.
Paul, just a couple of minutes left in our conversation here. You have started to advocate the changes in immigration policy. What do you think the smartest approach is?
Well, I mean, during World War, we're in the middle of a war against Muslim terrorists. During World War II, we not only blocked immigration of Germans and Japanese, but stopped naturalization of those already here, and we certainly did not open the floodgates to war refugees from those countries in the middle of the war. And what we need to do, and there's a DHS actually keeps a list, and I report it in infiltration. I list these countries. They have a list of Muslim countries who are most hostile to the U.S. in the West, and they rank them. And we can start with those countries for a moratorium, putting some curbs on immigration from these countries. I mean, our FBI doesn't have the resources to even get a handle on all of the ISIS jihadist threat, homegrown terrorists in the Muslim community. And now we're going to lay on top of that all these new immigrants who are even potentially more radical on top of that threat matrix. I mean, that's just ridiculous.
Paul, some folks may listen to that and say, sure, a percentage of Muslims could present huge problems to our national security, but many do not. Is there an effective screening process that could be implemented, even if our government right now isn't adhering to that? And would that be preferable to keeping everyone out?
we just don't have the information. The FBI admits they do not have the information on the ground that they need, unless the FBI is going to go into these failed states, which isn't going to happen, to rely on. They do not have the police records, the police reports, that they can make objective decisions on these folks coming in. So it's a pure sympathy play to let all these folks in on blind trust, and we just cannot do that. We have to have moratoriums here. And this is the assumption that we're making that all Muslims coming in from these countries, hate the terrorists and they love America and they love our culture. That's a naive assumption. I mean, time and time again, we've seen that we've been burned on that. And I mean, we've also already had examples of Iraqis we brought in Kentucky who turned out to be raising money for Al-Qaeda. These were so-called refugees. We had all these Somalis who came into Minneapolis. The FBI's camped out there now. I mean, it's so bad. They're being churned out in the mosque there and going over and joining Al-Qaeda and as well as ISIS and Al-Shabaab. So why would we want to import a culture that is hostile to America, and one that promotes violence against non-Muslims and women? I mean, the examples of the folks coming over here who are oppressing women and doing violent acts against women is well documented, and we're ignoring that to our own detriment.
Paul, unfortunately, we'll need to call time there. Thank you, sir, very much for your time and your insight today.
Thank you, Greg.
Absolutely. Paul Sperry is an author and columnist. His book is Infiltration: How Muslim Spies and Subversives Have Penetrated Washington. He recently wrote about immigration policy for Investors Business Daily in a column you can find on their site. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.
In 2011, as NATO was bombing Libya and ramping up the war in Syria, Israeli citizen Avi Lipkin was on Trunews. He told me that he was informed, again, this is 2011, early 2011. He told me that he had been informed by Israeli sources that Barack Obama would use the Middle East chaos as the cover to bring millions of Middle Eastern refugees in the United States and eventually transform America into a Muslim country. Unbeknownst to many Americans, the U.S. State Department has been busy for years importing Muslim refugees into America and resettling them in small towns and cities across this nation. Maryland resident Ann Corcoran has been monitoring the secretive plan of the State Department. Her blog is refugeesettlementwatch.wordpress.com. That's refugeeresettlementwatch.wordpress.com. And Ann is on the telephone from her farm in Maryland. Ann, welcome back.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Rick.
And it's gotten a lot worse. It's gotten a lot worse since you were here months ago.
Oh, it absolutely has gotten worse. And you hit the nail on the head about the chaos in Libya now creating a massive flow of quote-unquote refugees to Europe.
And this is not an accident. This is a coordinated strategy.
I'm thinking over the years, when you think back of every time there is one of these quote-unquote wars in the Middle East or North Africa or wherever, we end up with the refugees. Why is it our problem, I'd like to know, that we should take all the refugees?
All right. Now, you have uncovered, I believe, a list of, 190 U.S. cities that are being resettled by the U.S. State Department with Muslim refugees?
Yes, it's actually even more than that. That's just the number that the State Department lists itself on its website. But it takes a little time to find this stuff, and there's no question that one of my biggest problems is that the secrecy that's behind this program, that the average citizen has no clue what is happening to their towns and what is going to happen to their towns.
How's it working? Give us an idea. When they choose an American town to bring Muslim refugees from Somalia or Libya, Syria, wherever, what's the process? How does this work that they get into the town, into the city, and the refugees start pouring in, and the local residents really don't know what's going on?
Right. Let me just start at the top, though, briefly to refresh your listeners who may not have heard our first conversation a while back. The United Nations picks our refugees, the majority of them. So there you go, right in the beginning. You're going to have some questionable people coming in. They give a list to the U.S. State Department. They are supposed to be screened by Homeland Security, but I will ask, how do you screen people, especially Syrians and Somalis coming from failed states where there's no records of who they are or any obtainable information about crimes they may have committed or anything they might have done in the past? We don't even know who they are when their birthdays are. So the State Department then has 9 major federal contractors that have church-sounding names, but these are contractors, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, Lutheran Immigration Refugee Service, and the list goes on. And they then have 350 subcontractors working for them in 190-plus cities that are the resettlement sites. But it can be, if you live in an area of even 100 miles from one of these cities, you can still get some of these refugees in your town.
Okay, so I want to make sure our audience understands this. The State Department is working with a list of faith-based organizations, religious organizations, Catholic, Lutheran, Baptist, and so forth.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And these are nonprofit religious organizations that are receiving federal money to coordinate and resettle refugees from Africa and the Middle East.
That's exactly right. And your listeners should know this is not a program where they're passing the plate in church for this. These are organizations receiving as much as 98% of their funding from the federal government.
So these agencies are really, these religious agencies are just fronts for the State Department.
Oh, absolutely. That's exactly right. They're fronts for the State Department. But they love to confuse small-town America that thinks, oh, it's just my local, Catholic charities that's doing good work here. And nobody ever thought to ask, for years and years, nobody ever thought to ask who's paying for this. So we have a right as taxpayers. We have a basic right to understand what they're doing to our towns in advance. But that doesn't happen in advance. The only way people get any word on this is if somebody, leaks some information or some news article writes a puff piece about how refugees are going to be coming, isn't this lovely? Then the town knows that something's up. And but there's never advance warning.
We saw this last year with the flood of Central American children coming across the border, which I still, to this day, do not believe that little children walked from Guatemala to Texas. I mean, I wouldn't drive it, let alone walk it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, most are teenage boys. The statistics show that the majority are teenage boys.
Yeah. Well, I still believe most of them flew on the George Soros airline. That they were chartering. I absolutely believe it. I believe that they were chartering planes and flying them to the Texas border, and then they just walked across. But once they came into Texas, there was a Baptist organization that was receiving them, and this Baptist organization was receiving millions of dollars from the federal government, and they were processing all these refugee children and teenagers. And if you recall, that's when the story came out that American doctors and nurses who were there looking at these children became alarmed by the secrecy that was imposed by this Baptist organization, and the doctors and nurses were ordered not to talk to anybody, not to talk to the media, not to talk to members of the Congress or the American public, and they used the term, the brown shirts are here. And the brown shirts were the private corporate security that this Baptist organization had hired to provide security inside the refugee camp in Texas. Well, of course, brown shirts refer to the Nazis.
Right, yes.
And this picture is not pretty. I mean, I'm telling you, the deeper you go into it, it's not pretty.
Yeah, let me just tell your listeners one thing about what Obama is doing here with these unaccompanied alien children. He wants them to be designated refugees or legitimate asylum seekers, and it's an effort to expand the definition of refugee. Anybody in the world will be a refugee then if they just claim they're poor and they're afraid of crime in their home country. refugees are specifically supposed to have been persecuted for their religion, their race. These are not persecuted people. But Obama, in doing this, he's muddying the water and expanding the definition of refugee. So anybody poor in the world could come to America.
All right, this is precisely what Nigel Farage said in Great Britain this week. He said the new EU policy says anybody fleeing poverty is now an asylum seeker.
Right, and that is just absolutely against long-term international law on refugees. This is a huge scam they're perpetuating because the average person doesn't even understand what is a refugee, what is an asylum seeker, and in fact, even escaping war is not originally part of being a designated refugee unless you were personally persecuted for some reason during that war. So even war isn't a legitimate reason for refugee status.
Okay, let's go back to the State Department and the cities. So the UN selects the refugees that they're sending to each nation, and then here in the United States, the State Department receives that list and says, okay, send us all of these refugees, and we will send them into American towns and cities, and we'll make sure they have housing and income and so forth. So where does it go then?
Yeah, I need to step back there. Homeland Security does have a role in here. They're supposed to screen them, which we briefly discussed. Right now, the United Nations has selected for America 11,000 Syrian refugees that they wanted to get in here by September 30th. They're not going to make it because our FBI, believe it or not, our FBI is saying we can't screen these people. We don't know who they are. So the program is grinding to almost a standstill for the Syrians. So, yes, Homeland Security does have a role in here, but again, how do you screen people from a failed state? So, do you want to talk about the towns?
Sure, yes, go ahead.
Yeah. So, anyway, there are 190-plus towns that have a refugee contractor working in the town, and again, they can resettle refugees outside the town and in neighboring towns and cities as well. And but the good news is that there are pockets of resistance forming, and when I use that phrase, that's the government's own phrase. In June of 2013, I was at an Office of Refugee Resettlement meeting in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and in dire tones they warned that pockets of resistance were forming in the United States to this plan. And they had hired, the federal government had hired a contractor called Welcoming America, which is basically a community organizing outfit, like Obama was a community organizer. It's a community organizing left-wing outfit whose job it is to go around the country and try to tamp down any pockets of resistance that might form.
And you're the chief troublemaker.
Well, not the chief. I'm not alone. I can't say I'm alone. There are people catching on all around the country. There's a couple of people in the country who have been doing this longer than I have, which is basically watchdogging this program almost as I hate to use the word hobby because it's a dreadful hobby, but as a duty. Let's say my own charitable endeavor
a citizen duty. Do you have, on your website, do you have a list of the 190-some American towns and cities that are currently being resettled?
I do. It's a little hard. I mention it. I try to mention it almost every day. It's a State Department. Well, put out by the Office of Refugee Resettlement. But the State Department, let me just say back to these children when they're trying to make them refugees, the State Department actually put out this list when they announced their new Central American Refugee Program, which is a big scam, for these children. And you have to, if you want to work in this program, you have to go through these contractors in these cities. You're not even allowed to use other resources. You have one more scam for them to get money from the federal government. So yes, I do have it. I would encourage people to email me and I'll send them a link.
Okay,
that would be the best thing.
Can you name a couple American cities that are really being hit hard?
Well, the city being hit the hardest are the ones I believe in Minnesota, Minneapolis. Oh my gosh, I was just out there last week touring Minnesota. Minneapolis is just swamped with Somalis. We are, by the way, bringing 800 to 900 new Somalis into the United States every month. So go figure, why are all of these Somalis our concern? Many people argue, oh, well, with the Iraqis, we broke Iraq. It's our duty to take care of them, which I think is a bunch of what. But still, with the Somalis, why are we taking any Somalis, I would ask? And then they turn around and they want to go back and join ISIS and al-Shabaab.
And these Somalian Muslims are the same people that slaughtered hundreds of Christian college students in Kenya last month.
That's exactly right.
Beheaded them or shot them.
Mm-hmm.
And these are the people we're bringing to this country.
Right. Why? Everybody listening should call your congressman and say, why are we bringing Somalis and other Muslims to the United States every month? And then when they go to these towns, the contractor's main job, when I say contractor, subcontractor, these quote-unquote church groups or religious groups, their main job is to get the refugee hooked up with the social services in the town. And in 3 to 6 months, the contractor's done with them. They've got them on food stamps. They've got them on in subsidized housing. They've got their health care arranged, their kids in schools, and they move on to the next batch of paying clients because they are paid by the head to resettle them. So there's no incentive to ever slow the flow.
All right.
Let me just
go ahead.
Yeah.
No,
I was going to say some of the cities that are pushing back. Manchester, New Hampshire is pushing back. Amarillo, Texas is pushing back. I get a lot of pleasure out of knowing that Lynn and Springfield, Massachusetts are pushing back, and that's because Senator Ted Kennedy, this is his baby. He created this program in 1980, and so Massachusetts has Democratic mayors saying we can't handle this flood. Lewiston, Maine has some pushback. We're hoping St. Cloud, Minnesota pushes back. I was there last week. They have a huge Somali population and tension going on in their school system over problems with the Somali students. Anyway,
And we have, I got about 4 or 5 minutes remaining. One of the key players in the United States is David Miliband. Now, for our listeners, I want them to understand who this character is. David's brother, Ed Miliband, is a prominent politician in Great Britain. Ed Miliband may become the Prime Minister of Great Britain. The election is coming up in a very short time, and his Labour Party is fighting furiously to regain control. If it wins, he will become the Prime Minister. Well, Ed Miliband's nickname in Great Britain is Red Ed because he's a communist. Okay, his brother, David Miliband, another commie, is deeply involved in the United States in bringing these refugees here. Tell us what you know about him.
Yeah, David Miliband is the new president and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, which is the largest of the 9 federal contractors financially. I mean, it doesn't bring the most refugees. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops actually brings the most. But in financial terms, the International Rescue Committee, based in New York City, is the top 9 of the 9 resettlement contractors. David Miliband is the former Foreign Secretary and the brother of Ed, as you said, of the U.K. And about 2 years ago, he got the job of running this American resettlement agency, and he is best friends with George Soros, Hillary Clinton, the whole bunch of them, Samantha Power in the UN. They all pal around together. They were all thrilled to death that David Miliband should come to New York to run this agency. And just last week or the week before, Miliband called for the United States to take 65,000 Syrian refugees by the end of Obama's term in office by 2016, which is just unbelievably incredible. That is the number way beyond anything we've probably ever taken since the Vietnam War, which was under a different kind of a refugee program.
And have you considered the possibility that this policy is to deliberately flood America with Muslims to tip the balance of power in this country towards Islam?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, yes, I think it is. One of the things that people need to understand, which you talked about in the beginning of this, is that Europe is on the ropes. And it doesn't take a majority. I mean, people are probably going, oh, yeah, we're 350 million people. It's going to take a while for them to get that many. But it doesn't take that many. And as we'll see in Europe, with countries that are 10% populated by Muslims, they start pushing for Sharia compliance. People start backing down. it's not even just a terrorist; it's just a civilizational change that they push for to bring about Sharia in these countries, where again, the population of Muslims is probably only about 10%, yet they are starting to have enormous power. And I think we only need to look to that to see. I mean, the writing is on the wall for us. We really do need to stop this Muslim. We need to have a moratorium on Muslim immigration to America.
Well, Barack Obama promised to transform America, and he's doing it. He's the only politician I've ever seen in my lifetime who has carried out his campaign promises. And he promised to transform the country. And he has done a great deal of harm to this nation, and he has more on the way. And his buddy, George Soros, what is George Soros's main goal? A world without borders. And this is what they're doing. They are moving people from various civilizations and societies throughout the West in order to break down the Western Christian culture, to destroy borders, nationalities, to destroy everything about the identity of those nations, whether it's the United States or Canada, Great Britain, France, the Netherlands. If it's a Western Christianized nation, they are doing everything possible to break down that civilization, that society, in order to have a one-world system. That's the main goal. That's where they're taking this thing. And so they have to mix up the populations all over the world to break it down.
Right. They're changing America by changing the people. They're just literally swapping out the people.
That's right.
It'll take a little bit of time. Do we have a minute? I'd like to tell your listeners about what Trey Gowdy's done recently.
Yes, go ahead.
Whether you like him or not.
No, he's good. He's a good man. He's a good man. What's he doing?
Okay, good. Well, his town of Spartanburg, South Carolina, was shocked about a month ago to learn that they're going to get refugees. It's in his district that new refugees are coming. So in response, Trey Gowdy, who happens to be the chairman of this Judiciary Subcommittee on Immigration and Border Security and responsible for this program, refugees were being secretively planned for his town. So he has sent a letter to the Secretary of State, John Kerry, and said to Kerry, I wanted answers to 17 excellent questions, the same kind of questions we ask in every town in America where we learn about this. Who okayed this? Who's coming? How are they vetted? So on and so forth. And we are urging everybody to call Trey Gowdy and ask him to hold hearings in his subcommittee. He is responsible for oversight for this program. So I would urge everybody listening to contact Trey Gowdy, thank him for writing a wonderful letter and asking the questions we all want answered, but we need hearings. To my knowledge, there have never been a serious oversight hearing of this program in 35 years.
Well, I hope the congressman sticks to it and gets it done, but my guess is John Boehner will eventually shut him down. That's where I've seen everything go.
And possibly Lindsey Graham as well. You know, remember Lindsey Graham, his senior senator there in South Carolina, is big open borders kind of guy. Oh,
Lindsey, don't even get me started on Lindsey Graham.
Yeah.
Ann Corcoran, the blog is refugeeresettlementwatch.wordpress.com. And you stay on them. Don't let them get away with this stuff.
Thanks. Hey, can I mention my little book? I have a little book at Amazon called Refugee Resettlement and the Hijra to America. Hijra is the Islamic doctrine of migration. So it's Refugee Resettlement and the Hijra to America.
All right.